Hello, check, check, check. Good morning, good afternoon. Ano kaya? Are you looking at the level or you're looking at responses from the Zoom? If your audio is good. Ano? We are checking the Zoom if your audio is good. Okay, is my audio good, please? Comment na lang. Yeah, okay. So
Pwede.
thumbs up. Good. Practice for that. Just joking. We can teach us to go on karaoke. No, God. No. It's better.
Para po din silang mag-question.
For questions, please use the Q&A. Indigenous Studies lecture series. Here this afternoon with Professor Paredes. What is the event? Both yes, ADR as well as I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our faculty here from CSS today, as well as our students, both from the Anthro and History
majors of the BA Social Sciences program, as well as our students from the Indigenous Studies program here at UCB. We're also joined by people on Zoom. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Thumbs up if you can hear me on Zoom. Over 900 people are registered for this event, so hence the need for a Zoom webinar, just to give everyone the opportunity to join us today with this lecture. We're so happy to have Professor Oona Paredes, a visiting scholar from UCLA, an ethnohistorian and an anthropologist by training. Over her wondrous career, she's completed ethnographic and archival studies of the WUMED in Southern Philippines. Her current research looks at traditions of political authority among the WUMED. Today, her lecture is titled People of the Book, Centering Indigenous Peoples in Research Design and Knowledge Production in Mindanao. After the lecture, you'll have the opportunity to ask her some questions, both on Zoom and in person. So make sure to take some notes if there are some questions you'd like to ask. Otherwise, welcome again. Thank you so much for coming. And let's give it up for Professor Oona Paredes, who's here with us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, I'm going to put up here. So first, I wanted to thank the university for inviting me, especially Dean Leah Bayao. She's someone who I've always wanted to collaborate with, and I'm just so happy for this opportunity to speak before you today. And of course, I wanted to thank all of you in the Indigenous Studies program and in ethnohistory. I think that it's really wonderful that you have these programs here. It's not something that you find in a lot of universities, even in my own at UCLA. And of course, I wanted to thank all the students who've taken the time to come here. I know some of you are kind of forced to come because of courses, but for those of you who've taken the time to even look into ethnohistory or Indigenous studies as something to learn from, even if it's not something that you want to make a career out of. It's always, I think, for me personally, a very worthwhile area of study. So I really appreciate when students take an interest in what most people would think is an obscure topic. I think it's a very relevant topic in this world today. So I wanted to explain a little bit about the title, People of the Book, Centering Indigenous Peoples in Research Design and Knowledge Production in Mindanao. Okay. But People of the Book, the reference here is to how Christians are described, or certain religions are described in the Islamic tradition. So there's supposed to be kind of a special status people of the book because, like Muslims, Christians and Jews have a scripture. So that's the reference to the people of the book. Now, the people that I work with, the Hikonan Lumad of Northern Mindanao, especially the populations that the communities that I work with, and the specific people I'll be talking to you about. The relevance of this title to them is because they are now evangelical Christians. And so technically they would be people of the book in that kind of classification, but at the same time, they also come from an oral tradition. So they don't have a literary tradition in their culture. And what I'm going to talk to you about today centers on the process of creating a book out of their oral tradition. So that's the sort of the main focus that we have today. And in the course of doing that, then they themselves are becoming people of the book, and they're trying to kind of make a literary culture out of their oral tradition. So that's the significance of the text. Yeah. So I don't have a clicker, so this is my clicker. Yeah. So yeah. So what I'm going to talk about today is the process of creating this book that I'm going to explain about. It's about their oral traditions, referred to as the Panos more broadly. And then at the same time, also maybe talking about how we learn and unlearn about the past and about our sense of the past, as well as questions of heritage and identity and tradition versus innovation, and how as my own process and of of learning and unlearning about these things in the course of this research. And of course, the lessons learned about collaborative research with an IP community. So this is basically just to locate where I do my research. And so this is northern Mindanao. You recognize the province names. Now, I'm from Misamis Oriental myself, in a small town called Medina, which is directly across the bay from Camiguin. And the Higaonon area that I'm talking about is this, the area that's shaded. Basically, it's a borderland area in between two regions, several provinces. I work more in the sort of the corner of Misamis Oriental and Bukidnon and Espan. So right in the corner area. In fact, the ancestral domain that I work in mostly actually crosses over into the Agusan provinces. And if you wanted to get an idea of what it looks like, this photo here on the left is from when I first went there in the early 90s. It's an area that looks like it has primary or climax forest. And this is in a valley kind of, in a valley sort of setting, riverine valley. And so you have this sort of primary looking forest, and but it's really deceptive because this area was logged over in the 60s and 70s. And so the next picture, this is what it looked like last year. For those, there was someone who talked to me yesterday who had met Dato Ramil. This is taken from the view deck that they have. So I encourage you to go there. Yeah, and so this is overlooking the valley of the ancestral domain of the particular community, Baligian, that I've been working with the longest. So, yes, I know it's beautiful. It's just in the morning, my favorite place in the world. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the book and how we made the book. But to get there, we have to start with my original field project, which was what was mentioned in the introduction, a study of traditional political authority. And it really has to do, my interest was in examining how people today in the Higaonon community understand leadership and, and of course, in the course of that, traditional leadership, and how maybe these ideas about leadership and political authority, ideas about tradition, have changed over the generations, especially with increased interaction with the government, the LGU system. Okay, and then of course with with the coming of IPRA and having to have like tribal councils to deal with a different sort of slice of governance. Well, so you have all these multiple layers of governance and political authority that they have to contend with. So that was my main interest. Now, at the time I was beginning this research it was like around 2011, 2012. That was when NCIP started talking about FPIC process, okay, free, prior, informed consent. Now, this is something that's already deeply embedded in the ethics of anthropologists. It's already part of ethnographic methods, the ethics that you have to practice as far as the US is concerned, American anthropology is concerned. And so I was already familiar with the idea of free, prior, informed consent, but this was a NCIP government process. And I was interested to see how it was going to play out in the Philippines. And so I think my case, my particular study on political authority was the first one that they were dealing with in Region 10 that had to do with academic study rather than, let's say, logging or mining or something, exploitative like that. And so it's an experiment for everyone. Now, without getting bogged down in the details, basically, what I did was I picked several communities that we would go to and consult. And the process we followed with the local NCIP was we would all go there, gather the respective communities, especially their tribal councils, and I would present what I wanted to do. And we would do Q&A. They would ask me questions and I would have to answer to their satisfaction. And we'd negotiate, what kind of working relationship we could possibly have. And then they would decide whether they wanted to work with me or not. So it was all a process of negotiation. Now, some of you have expressed to me concern about undergoing FPIC. And of course, I can't speak to how that happened up here in the north, but in the south and in my particular area, the NCIP people at the time had been long established and had in fact worked for OSCP before it was NCIP. And so there was kind of already an existing working relationship, and we were all interested in experiment and how it would play out. So I went through 3 different communities, and so this is one of them. This is the Kalipai Tribal Council, it's not a very clear picture, but it's a mix of status and Bais. This is a male and female traditional leaders. The next picture is of go back one, a bit larger, sayang hindi masyadong clear, a slightly larger tribal council, because it's actually for a very large, what do they call it, unified ancestral domain claim called Tachiko, and it's in Haruhay and Cavaria area. And the very last was the Baligian Tribal Council, and these are the people that I am most familiar with and have been working with since the early 90s. And in each case, each consultation with the tribal council as part of the FDIC process, what I found was a very lively discussion, very lively question and answer period, and a really interesting mix of, people demanding certain things from me, but also offering a lot of really, really interesting input on how I was doing my project wrong. Okay, I was doing it wrong. And every single tribal council said the same thing. You can't do this unless you learn the Panud. Panud is oral tradition. And the thing is, my Higaonon is not that good. And Panud, I know, is deep language, deep archaic language. So I thought, this is impossible. I can't learn the Panud first and then do the research. And so we kind of went back and forth about how to do it. And eventually we came up with the idea that we would do it concurrently. But basically it was required of me. They said, nothing you study or every question you have about political authority and tradition, none of that can be answered without knowing the Panud. And every single one of them said that. And so I thought, well, I had better listen, right? So that was sort of built into the agreements that I formed with the communities. I worked with Kalipai and Baligian. Patrick was not interested in working with me. Can you turn this down? So then that's what we had to do. So we had to kind of figure out how I was going to learn the Panud. There's quite a few Tatus or indigenous leaders, as well as Bais, who know the Panud, especially bits of the Panud, but it was still to be determined whether there was one person who I could really learn from to really be a mentor. And so the thing that I did was I went to the person that all the Tatus and Bais said was sort of the most respected authority, at least in that part of Higaon land. And oh, sorry, I should explain the Panud. So the Panud is basically Higaonan oral tradition, and it appears the form that it takes is a genealogy. So on the surface, it seems like a very simple kind of thing. It's a genealogy: who came from, what ancestors came from the ancestors before them, and stories about their lives. So it seems like a very straightforward, simple thing. But as in the course of this genealogy, there are actually a lot of things that you learn when you listen to the Panud. So there's a lot of stuff there about their settlement history, their heritage, the development, the innovations that became sort of these traditions, a lot of political histories of warfare, and the development of gender ideologies, ethics, things like how to treat visitors, things about religion or their spiritual law. So all of these things are sort of woven into this rich fabric of the Panud, even though the Panud on the surface seems like a genealogy. So it's really a lot more than that. And I could compare it to the Bible or the Torah, which is the original Jewish form, right? So it's the very beginning of it is you have the begat, like the different Jewish ancestors and who begat who. So that's a simple genealogy. But when you look at the Torah as a whole and what later becomes the Bible, there's a lot in the Old Testament, a lot more in there than just the stories of the ancestors. You have spiritual laws, you have dietary laws, and all sorts of other stuff like that. So, yeah, it also includes a whole section on agriculture and how to properly do agriculture. Called Ibabako. So, all right, and then so I had to basically figure out how they're going to teach me this Panood, and I thought it's really kind of a easy proposition for everybody because my Higaonon was not that deep. And this is, I know, something that requires lifelong learning. For example, the main doctor that I work with now, or ended up working with, he was taken out of school in second or grade 2 or 3 because his father wanted him to learn the Panood and learn the tradition. And he acknowledged there was no way that he could be going to school and learning the Panood at the same time because it's memorized, learned over a lifetime, over many, many years. And so he had to kind of really be focused on that kind of cultural formation and also development of his memory to accommodate this very, very broad and heavy oral tradition. So I didn't have high hopes for myself personally. But I talked to this guy. His full name is Dr. Ulukuman Yukmo, and otherwise known as Dr. Yukmo. He passed away last year in September, and until his death, he was the most widely respected, the single most widely respected Datu as far as customary laws were concerned in Higaonon land, or across northern Mindanao, across all Higaonon territories. And he is a very, very interesting character that we'll talk about another time. I'm going to write an article about this guy. But he is basically seen as a political authority by everyone. And I asked him, look, if I want to learn this, and he actually told me the same thing that all the other tribal councils told me about my project. You have to learn the Panood. It's all in the Panood. All the answers you're looking for are in the Panood. And so I said, well, how should I learn it? He goes, well, you know Datu Budua. I said, yes, he's from Baligyan. I've known this guy for 20 years already. He goes, he's the one. He's the one that knows all of it. Everyone knows a little bit. He's the one who is the master of all of it. Actually, the word he used is hustler. Yeah, I've been a hustler. That was his term, of all the people who know about the Panood. And so with that knowledge or with that reassurance, I then went back to Baligyan to assemble the Panood team. Next slide. So this is the original Panood team that we formed in 2013, actually beginning 2012. There's a couple of other people who are missing from this picture, but this is the core group. And they're all related to each other. They're all part of the Antihagan family. And there were a couple of other people from other families to represent all the families from Baligyan in the project. And so from left to right, you have, not yet, but you have Datu Mandulguan, who is the elder here, and his nephew, Datu Budua, who is the Mikpanud. And then you have Tahak Binanogan, who is a cousin of theirs, and then another cousin on the right, Santua Antihagan, who is the Mixulat. And what those words mean is that Mikpanud he's the guy who is the person who recites the Panood. Or if we're going with, comparing it to Jewish tradition, he's the cantor. And then the Mixulat is the one who writes down, who's going to write down basically take notes when we were studying the Panood. Now the thing with the discussion that we had about this project was Datu Budlua himself was interested in getting the Panood down into written form. Because he was concerned, and I mean, a lot of people were concerned, but especially since he was the one who was the pinaka-hustler, right, and who knew everything, he was concerned about his own health. He's about maybe early 60s now, and he really understood in a very grave way that if anything happened to him, no one else was going to know what he knew because no one was interested in mentoring with him. No young people were interested in actually learning the Panood the way that he had. And so he felt a kind of a duty, a responsibility to the next generation to have it written down somehow. And he said, let's find a way to record it just somehow, maybe tape it or something. And so because of this sort of demand that I studied from all these different tribal councils, it sort of legitimized that whole idea that we would try to write it down. That's why we had a mixed lab. It wasn't just to take notes, but to really try to write it down. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so this is part of the Panood team in action. Now, I showed all those other people there, and there were a couple other extraneous people who wanted to participate in the process. It was kind of very exciting for a while, and all these people were joining in, and every time we would have a session where we would listen to the Make Panood recite something, and we would have people try to write down what he was saying. Okay, we had a selection process to figure out who the Make Sulat would be. It ended up being Sansua because he was the most accurate. But so eventually it became the team shrank into these basically two core people, the Make Panood and Make Sulat. And so the Make Panood is Datu Budlua Antihagan. And then the next one is Santo Antihagan, his cousin. And I wanted to give also special recognition to Santo's wife, Yaga, Yaga. And the women were participants in this process as basically the people who prepared the snacks. I know that sounds really bad, and especially me being a woman, there's definitely a gender bias here in terms of who was working in the Panood, even though it was not necessarily seen as men's work. Okay, but that's just how it's divided up in this community. And so, but the wives of the participants in the team were all vital to this whole enterprise because they're the ones who enabled their husbands to actually do the work. So, okay. Next. Yeah, so this is a still from a video of Datu Budlua when we were undergoing the process of, or beginning the process of writing down the Panood. And it was really quite exciting. And you see, this is an action shot. Like I said, it's a video still. And I used video as an experiment. It was really just for fun, not supposed to be a methodological thing. And Datu Budlua is a very animated storyteller. And so when he would be reciting the Panood, he wouldn't just be sitting down and making this sort of recitation. There would be action. There would be jumping around, getting up off of his chair, and then just doing this kind of stuff. And so there would be like action shot, especially, I mean, action, when he's talking about warfare and stuff like that. Very, very expressive, which brings me to one key difference between oral tradition and written tradition that we saw really up close and personal in terms of this Panood project. So before I get into that, so I wanted to make it clear that my original project, which I'm still trying to do, was to interview people and gather data about traditional political authority. And then it evolved into, bifurcated into this project, which was the Panood project. And eventually, what became the Panood project, it became an almost entirely community-run project. And it was basically Budlua and Sunsua running it, plus other people assisting. And there were many reasons for that. One was the fact that I could not be there all the time. And it ended up being a 10-year process. Okay, so I know there's a lot of stuff going on here, but yeah, so this is Dr. Budlua. Now, in the course of what we all thought was going to be a very simple process, which was to listen to Dr. Budlua, recite parts of the Panood, and then we would write it down. We thought it would just be like that. It's not that complicated, right? You write down oral tradition. Okay, simple, okay? But from the very beginning, we ran into serious epistemological issues, okay? And so the main one being, and that's the next, the main issue being, how do you translate an oral tradition into written form? It's actually not as simple as it sounds, okay? It's not simple at all. One of the fundamental problems is that oral tradition and literary tradition are completely different animals, okay? Completely different species. And so there's several key differences. And of course, the main difference is the form that they take, right? So our understanding of oral tradition, we recited. Literary tradition is written down. It seems that that's just a simple thing, but it's really not. Because oral tradition is not simply, it's not, I think most of us have an understanding of oral tradition as being pre-literate tradition. It's actually not. It's its own thing. And writing stuff down from an oral tradition is not necessarily preserving the oral tradition. You're just making a written tradition. You're putting it in written form, and you can never capture the oral tradition at its, in its entirety. Okay, that's because there's very, very different aspects to oral tradition that you don't have in written tradition. In fact, once you become familiar with oral traditions, and some of you have already worked with oral traditions, you can appreciate that it's so multidimensional. There's so much stuff going on in oral tradition, whereas if by comparison, a written form, a written tradition is very flat and two-dimensional. Okay. Now, one of the key differences is the performance aspect, because oral tradition, especially the panood, is performed. So Dr. Budo, a very animated person, when he's reciting parts of the panood, he performs with his whole body. Okay, and it's not just that he's doing action. There's also an interaction with the audience that determines the direction that the oral tradition performance takes. There's certain inflections that he can use with certain audiences when he's reciting certain words that can either nuance the meaning or change the meaning of something altogether. And again, without belaboring the point, there's a lot of comparison here that we can make with Jewish tradition in the Torah and how it's recited. But also, Torah is written down, but it's actually an oral tradition originally. And they do those kinds of inflections and stuff as well. So there's that performance, the inflection, the audience participation, all of that is missing from the written. So how then do you translate it? The translation becomes a lot. It's like converting from a full, when you're in the recording music, for example, if you have, let's say, music recorded in a recording studio, and then you transfer it to a multi-track kind of recording, and then you transfer it to LP or vinyl form, and you're slowly losing resolution there. And then when you transfer it to CD form, you even lose more of the other noise that comes along with it. And then from there to MP3 form, then you have like a very, very, very kind of very actually boring version of the music when compared to the original multi-track recording, or even compared to a live performance. Completely different things. Sorry, I hope that makes sense. So if you have, for example, a live performance of a band versus an MP3, the difference is if you're a fan of music, the difference is profound. So it's sort of a very similar thing. But the other one other big difference is also in oral tradition, the sense of the pastness is a completely different thing in oral tradition than it is in written tradition. As I mentioned yesterday in the Q&A, oral tradition versus written tradition deal with very, very oral history and or sort of Western choreography deal with very, very different kinds of questions about the past. Okay, and oral tradition tends to focus on meaning and significance and how people in the present generation understand what happened in the past and what the past is supposed to mean to the present. Whereas in more traditional Western historiography, you have maybe a notion, a very kind of deceptive notion that there is an objective way to understand the past. That the past is just about, history is just about the facts of what happened. In oral tradition, you never have that kind of question. Okay, so you have, so I'm trying to kind of like, explain how there's so many epistemological issues here that are at play. And the other key difference, or the other sort of key issue that we came across when we were trying to do this from the very beginning was the idea of authorship and authority. Because in the oral tradition, when the Mikmanod performs it, he performs it as part of the heritage, it's cultural performance, and it's seen as kind of owned by everyone, and it's a community sort of activity. All right, it's not something that, even though you acknowledge that the Mikmanod is the one who's reciting this, it's really about the whole community, and it's usually done in community events. everything about it is community centered. Whereas when we're writing it down, then there becomes the question of authorship. Who is acknowledged as the author of this work when we put it in written form? We're making a book. Who's going to be the author of the book? Not only that, but also authority. Okay? Who becomes the owner of this written form? So these are questions that we were beginning to grapple with from the very, very beginning, and a lot of debates were going on that had to do with that. And so, in the spirit of kind of getting you to appreciate just how complex this thing was, I would like to actually show a short video clip, about 5 minutes. And yeah, so I guess if you can set that up. Yeah, so before she starts, let me explain that it's a, hopefully it can be shown on the screen here, is that it's unedited video. And again, this was taken just for fun at the time, and we ended up videoing a lot of the session. There's no subtitles, so I'll have to explain to you what's going on, but I don't think you'll really need to know the language to kind of understand, because there's a lot of interesting body language going on in the video. Let's see, what else should I say before we started? Yeah, maybe just play it. For you. Yeah, so what's going on here in the beginning was that's Datu Mandogoan. Can you have the audio? Me, and then that's Pahak over there, and then a couple other people. And so what you'll see here is Budlua trying to, sorry, it's a little going all over the place, Blair Witch Project sort of thing, where there's a lot of stuff going on, and basically they're stuck at a certain point because Budlua could not figure out the right words to use that would make sense.
Ulayan sa pagayuno.
So that's the guy who's writing it down. And he's arguing with Dr. Budlua that if you write it this way, it's not going to make sense. Somebody's reading it. Suddenly there's a stone, but nobody knows what the stone is. If you're out there from that village, and it's sort of like not introduced properly what Dr. was trying to say. And all these other people then have opinions about how it's really written down. And meanwhile, that little boy is trying to be nice, and trying to, trying to kind of assert his own authority here. But everybody else is supposed to be collaborative, not just with me, but with everybody else. Question authorship now. So he's saying, he's reciting, yeah, you can hear the audio.
Sa daludugan tabato na kailugan mi pa
If you say it this way, it's a big sense. And he's going to try to recite his way of remembering it through rhythmic chanting. He's mumbling to himself and going, trying to kind of get the right beat. And then the elder is helping him because he knows some stuff that Budlua doesn't know. But so they're both kind of chanting it under their breath and trying to figure out how you can make it fit. And everybody else has an opinion. So this guy in particular has a very loud voice, and he just likes to talk over everyone. See, he's mumbling to himself. He's trying to get it in the rhythm, and then at one point he says, if you can make it louder. Yeah, he basically says at one point, hadikasukat, which means it doesn't fit when he's reciting it, so he knows it's not how you're supposed to do it. So it wasn't a simple matter of, let's just find a word to explain it properly. It also had to fit the cadence of what he felt was the sort of proper way to put it into words. And so it's like a debate between the two of them. And Pahak starts talking and he's going like this. Anyway, so now Pahak and Santu are arguing with each other. Really sorry that there's no clear audio here. And everybody starts getting frustrated. So he's starting to kind of turn off. Okay, he's starting to disengage, and he's just rocking. And then the elder here, he starts singing a song at one point because they're beginning to kind of shut off from each other because everybody's got an opinion and everybody's talking. Yeah, including this guy who's bringing the mama, and then this guy who knows nothing but he has an opinion. And this guy, still keeps trying to, Budua still keeps trying to find the right word. And then this guy is very loud and he's talking. And then, so I keep going back and forth because I'm trying to focus on who's talking. And everybody's got something to say about it. And I mean, if you can understand even a little bit of Tika, it's actually really, really funny. One day I'm going to put subtitles on it and make it an ethnographic film that you can show. So he's looking at me, trying to tell me that this is how it's supposed to be. And then it's going to go, yeah. So they're talking amongst themselves. Meanwhile, Budua is still trying to figure it out. Okay. Are we at 5 minutes now of the video? Okay, yeah, so they're going back and then he's got an opinion again. And he doesn't know anything either, but he has an opinion and he's saying, no, you can stay this way, and he's just reading stuff back. And they're all doing it. And then this is my favorite part. So this is like debating and pinasa. And then, but meanwhile, me, the Mipanood, I'm just gonna be quiet. That's what he said. And he's just sort of like, yeah, okay. Yeah. And then it just goes on for a while. Yeah. Okay. So he's reciting stuff, trying to make it fit. Budua's reciting stuff, trying to make it fit. Eventually, they do find the right word. Okay, so we can stop the video now. Yeah, soon after this, but it's like another 5 minutes. But anyway, so that's what I wanted to share with you. It's a very lively kind of thing. And part of this whole experience that I was able to film, which was very interesting to me, was that these epistemological issues were dealt with directly in the process. Because you would think that, you know, with our own prejudices about, like Budua can barely read and write, okay? Other people like Shamtua, his cousin, can read and write pretty well. And he was involved in the translation of the New Testament into Hikaonon, working with Western missionaries. But all the other guys were sort of equally limited in their literary skills and their education. However, they were having PhD level discussions about epistemology. How do we know how we know, what we know? And if we're recited this way, this is our experience of it, but when you write it down, it changes the thing completely. And they were having these PhD level discussions that were more profound than grad seminars that I had attended in the US. Yeah. And it astounded me, and I gained a new respect for them. I mean, I already had respect for them, but to kind of appreciate that they were actually doing PhD level thinking there. And that's what Budua said, that in terms of customary law and the Panud, he's a PhD like me. Okay, but just in terms of Hikaonon tradition. All the other people are either undergrads or high school level or whatever, but Angki. So yeah, so there was a lot of epistemological issues that we continue to grapple with all throughout. Okay, and they had this really keen awareness that in the process of writing down this oral tradition, creating a written form of it for the purposes of heritage preservation. And then now we're going to use this also for language transmission in the IP education program in New York City. That even though in doing so, we are making an attempt to preserve tradition, to preserve heritage for future generations, we are also fundamentally transforming that oral tradition into something. Okay, so you can think of it as a loss or think of it as an innovation. Either way, the understanding was very clear from the very beginning. They understood it more profoundly than I did, that they're changing the tradition. Okay, and there's certain things that will just never be captured in the written form. So yeah, maybe the next slide. Yeah, so last year in early November, it was basically a 10-year process because there were a lot of things going on in my life. Lost the job and getting a new job and moving and all that stuff. And then also stuff going on with them, the pandemic. Basically, Sancho and Lulua worked together over 10 years very closely whenever they had free time. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 hours of night after farming all day. Some weeks they couldn't work at all. But basically in 10 years, they were able to kind of pull together enough stuff, still not a complete panod, but enough stuff that they felt like, okay, we can do this now. We can make it into a book. It's okay now. It's that we reached a kind of a good threshold. And in the course of doing it, in the course of that 10 years, we added another member of the team who was Jerry Obilno, who was my research assistant. Those of you who are here yesterday, I had that picture of a little boy in the group picture of the children, a little boy with a bowl cut who had no pants on. That's Jerry, and you'll see a picture of him in a second. And he basically did the final year because Sansua's eyesight was failing and his health as well. And so he took over as Mixula. And he's been really, really great. So this was basically the complete draft form that we put together. That's my hand. And so that's the title, Supanut sa Bolivian, Tukatisayan or Apo in Tampil. So the history of Apo of the ancestor in Tampil, who is a woman. The first ancestor mentioned in the Panut is a woman. Daos mga Otao Gabianay and the people of the distant past, Hanapuan, who Kalapaya Tagaliputan, basically who settled in this territory. Okay, so that's the full title. And it's like 260 something pages. And then yeah, so that's the page that those of you who worked on it. It's not so clear, but the first line is it says Tumigpanod is Tatu ng Pukawan Buto at Sihagan. And then the next line says mga duma din Kupaghinang, the people who worked with him, who accompanied him on this work. And so you have Apo Mandogo and Antihagan, and he's Apo now because he died in several years ago. So he was Migdaldag, somebody who basically supplemented Pulo's knowledge. Santo Antihagan was a Migsulat. Jerry Mandipanya Obilno was Migsulat, and Migtay because he entered it into the computer, all of the stuff that Santo had written down. And Suli, which basically sort of editor and cross-checker. And then me and his small response, make time, yeah, and then make Pandaya, I provided the funding for the book. So that's the sort of credits page. And then one more clip. Yeah, and then so this is one part of the table of contents. And basically, Anayadalan means the old road. Okay, so that's basically the most distant ancestor, Anayadalan. And then there's another section, which is the sort of the newer road, which are the more recent ancestors in living memory. So these guys are from like the moment of creation and that kind of stuff. So basically they're listed, they decided to list all of these things according to the ancestor. So that's what we did, the table of contents. So we had to make a decision about that as well. How do you divide them into chapters? We can't just have a run on text. People are going to have to be able to find stuff in a written form, right? Because you don't have the Maymig Panud there. When you're reading, when you have the written form of the Panud, you're on your own. So we had to figure out how to make it, how to index it, basically. So that was another major decision. Yeah. And then so we just gotten done, or Jerry got done cross-checking. I want to emphasize that this is them who are doing it. I'm just telling you, I provided funding and some very loose supervision, and some training. And so they've cross-checked with other communities. We gave them copies in order to have them kind of look through it and see if there were any errors that they spotted or anything else that they wanted to add or felt that things should not be included. For example, some stories are kind of triggering in terms of taboos, especially the Apo and Kampo story, the very first story. And Jerry just emailed me this morning saying he emailed me the final copy. And I'm basically, when I go to Manila next week, we're going to a press and we're going to print. And we're giving it free to the community and also to the IBH. So that's the plan at least, but hopefully that's what actually happened. Okay, and next. Yeah, so, and then this is from September, October last year. This is at my mom's house in Medina, Misamis Oriental. And what we decided we would do was, because we didn't want to just have the written form in the book, even though the goal was the book, right? That was our goal. But they felt very keenly, and I completely agreed too, that a lot of stuff is lost if you just have the written form only. So we recorded that to Budlua actually telling the story. Okay? And we did it, you know, section by section. We followed the table of contents. Not all of them are covered, or some of them, if you will, are covered all at the same time in one like 5-minute recording where he tells all the touches on the different stories. And but we had to figure out the setup. You know, we were low budget and it's noisy out in the provinces with all the chickens and the dogs and stuff like that. And it was next to the ocean, which is also loud. And so we were just sort of figuring out how to record things. And so this is going to accompany the book. It'll be like either a CD-ROM or I think what we're going to do is we're going to have like an online thing that they can link up to and watch. So we'll see how that whole thing works. But yeah, that's Jerry. That's the little boy in the bowl cut, and he's almost 30 years old now. And that's him sitting down. Yeah, so these were stills from that, and we had a lot of interesting challenges as well when we were trying to go through this whole process in 2022. Okay, next slide. Yeah. So one of the issues that we had really was, so not just the thing about putting oral tradition into written form, but there was like another layer of it by the time we got to 2022, was that how do we make these traditional things in so-called traditional culture relevant in this day and age? Because you can say you're preserving heritage all you want, but how does the younger generation actually receive it? How do you make it? They might be inherently interested in it, but how do you make it relevant in terms of access, in terms of sort of retrievability, how they can make it relevant in their daily lives? When so many of the kids now are on social media and have cell phones, and that's the kind of world that they occupy now. And also, they're also dealing with prejudice from mainstream society. And there's always this sort of internal battle between, if we're going to stay traditional, then we become sort of targets for prejudice from the mainstream, to some extent. So there's all these questions swirling around. And so, this is basically these are the questions that we're still left with. Yeah. So it's more than just when you say, let's preserve heritage, it's not that simple. When you say, we're going to write down oral tradition, it's not that. And all these challenges we face as a group, as a collaborative team, and we also went beyond the team, and after we were doing this, and especially towards the end when we had already a draft that we could give people, we went to different parts of the community, different communities, not just Baligyan, but anyone who was whose ancestors were covered in this panel. We went there and said, look, this is yours too. Read it, tell us how to improve it, or if you have anything, just participate in the process. So that's the collaboration went beyond the team, and we really tried to kind of be orientated towards sort of the broader community when it came to this. Yeah, next. Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to mention here before any kind of questions was, collaborative research. There were a lot of, a lot of people will say, oh yes, let's collaborate on research. It's inclusive. It's, especially working with IT. But there are some realities that we had to deal with. And so I wanted to kind of talk about them a little bit. There's a lot of challenges that we face in terms of collaborative research design. So in terms of the design perspective, that to me was the most interesting part of this, because from the very beginning, even before we went through the FBIC process, I was finishing up I'd already done my first part of my research, my book was coming out, and basically I returned to the community after a long absence. And I was saying, they're saying, okay, so what are you going to research next? And I said, I don't know, I'm still trying to figure out. And Butul actually told me, he goes, you should study Dhatu. You should study Dhatu. I said, yeah, that would be very interesting because it's changing. The Pagkadatu is changing. And he was the one who came up with that. That's his idea. And so in all the grants I applied for that were related to it, I put him as co-PI. Okay. And so I was kind of trying to be very conscious about that. And when it came to interviewing people in the community, in various communities, especially outside the Bolivian Higaonon community, but other Higaonon communities, when I was asked to interview people, I named Dr. Bodlua as the person I was answerable to, that if they had a problem with me and how I was doing things, that they could talk to him and he would set me straight. So I put myself under the authority of Dr. Bodlua. As you know, part of it was to be collaborative, but also to be genuinely sort of to try to genuinely make this research something that was about what they cared about and what was relevant to them, and to carry it in a way that was culturally not just sensitive culturally, but also effective, more effective culturally. And so that's what I did. And so from the very beginning, they were involved. Higaonons were involved in conceptualizing the project and what questions I was asking. That's where it all started from. And then when we went through the FBIC process, when the whole thing where they were saying you have to learn the Panood, that was also part of the collaboration that I saw, and it changed the research design of the project for the better. And I owe that to them. That wasn't something I came up with. They told me what I was doing wrong, or why they're pointing out to me how limited my research was because I didn't know enough about the Panood. So that was part of the lesson. So, and again, I want to maybe emphasize that this was the Panood project itself. The book here is actually a side project. It's not really my project. It's the community's project that I was involved with. And it was an offshoot of my original project, which I'm still, trying to work on, and that's going to be my book. So this book is their book. So even though I was part of that research, it's not my research, it's not my book, it's theirs. And that I see as a true collaboration. So that's why I call it collaborative research. Now the challenges. There's of course infrastructural challenges, financial challenges, and things like that. I already mentioned that the community views about heritage and ownership versus authorship, is something that we're still kind of struggling with on some level. The fact that every Panood remembers a slightly different version, and when there's been questions of jurisprudence in customary law, this is what I learned from Dr. Yukmo, was that if, for example, there's a dispute over territory, who has the right to farm in this particular spot of land versus that particular, if two families or two clans are in conflict, two kin groups are in conflict, and they went to Dr. Yukmo to resolve it, Dr. Yukmo would say, okay, what does your Panood say? And then somebody would recite it, and maybe the other person would have a Panood version of that version of their Panood, which was slightly different, which justified their side. If there was some kind of dispute, he would call Dr. Budlua and say, Dr. Budlua, what's the part of the Panood that deals with this thing, with their ancestors? And then he would recite it in that measured way, and that's what Dr. Yukmo would rely on. So it's more than just a genealogy, it's also their customary law, right? So let me say culture bearer here. So this is a side note. We call IPs culture bearers, especially traditional leaders and stuff like that. When it comes to oral tradition, a culture bearer is literally the bearer of the culture. Once that person dies, that vessel is lost. It's like burning down a library, okay? So literally, Budlua and all these other people are culture. They're carrying the culture within their body, and they perform it for their people. So yeah, so there's all these different challenges. But for me, the interestingly enough, the principal challenge, and it's probably the last thing I'm really going to talk about here, is there was a real, no matter how collaborative the efforts were and how explicit I was about how this is your project, our project, we're doing it together, and trying to kind of put them up, principal investigators and the authors of these things, the power imbalance between myself as an outside researcher, so not only from mainstream Filipino culture, but also someone who was an academic based in the US, okay? And them being members of IT communities and being marginalized by society, and not just the financial and political status imbalances, educational imbalance, and all these other power imbalances. That was constant. And that was probably the main struggle we had in working as a team, because I would constantly have to reinforce the idea that this is your book, this is your project. They would ask me, how can we do this? I would say, no, you tell me how you want to do it. We'll do it your way. And it was a constant thing, even up to now. We're still kind of struggling with that. And it just required a lot of constant reinforcement on my part. Even when we were presenting it to the communities, it took a while before Dr. Bulua then naturally took the lead when we were explaining what things were. And I had to, as an outside researcher, as a non-IT researcher, had to deliberately step away. Let's say the two of us would be standing there, and here we have this book, we would like you guys to read it, and they'll say, well, tell us more about the book. I would literally step away, and Bulua would be like, and then he would talk. But that's the only way, otherwise he would defer to me. And so this is like something that I think, for people doing research with IT communities, that to me has been the key challenge. Like up to now, we're still struggling with it. Such that when we finished it and we were presenting it to Paligian Tribal Council, the Tribal Council was thanking me for my hard work. And I said, no, I didn't do any of this work, but that's the book. And there's a lot of other things that went with that. But I think I'll close there. So this is what we went through to produce this book, and it's not quite finished yet. And I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I mean, I still have a lot of questions, and there's a lot I can tell you. But I hope at least that you found it kind of illuminating and interesting. Maybe the last slide. Yeah. So I wanted to share with you my email address at UCLA. Feel free to write me, and of course, I thank you for sitting through all of this. I hope it made sense. And if you have any questions, I'm here for as long as the dean doesn't kick me out. Yeah. Anyway, so thank you.
So we can accept some questions both from our audience here at the CSS AVR and also on Zoom. So please send your questions through the chat and we'll get to them shortly. But I'd like to hear some questions from the audience for Professor Oona. Does anyone want to go first? I've got a mic I can pass.
I'm sure we have one.
Yeah, I can see in there. I can see it.
If you're self-conscious about questions, what I tell my students always is there are no stupid questions, just stupid answers. Yeah, but there's no stupid questions. Kakanta na lang ako dito. Yeah.
You had mentioned that when they finally decided to publish book, to come up with a book, but they still had some other thing, some other stories of the panood that that hindi pa nila na parang hindi pa crystallized or something. Is there a plan to like parang keep adding to that or?
Yeah, there's a plan to keep adding, but we wanted to kind of find a stopping point and just basically release it as a product, while Bulua was still alive. And we could deal with any issues that came up in terms of like correcting errors and things like that. We waited until it was done. Maybe it'd be another 20 years. There's a lot of side stories. The thing about it is that so each of the stories we arranged according to the ancestor that it's focused on. But even each sort of chapter, they're usually like 2 pages, sometimes 3, sometimes 1 page long. Some of the chapters are only half a page because that's all, he had to say about that ancestor, even though that same ancestor appears in 5 other stories. So it's not neat and tidy because the way he recites the panod is that there's like just finds a starting point and then follows that thread. It's not necessarily a set beginning and a set end. Although there's a way of doing that. You start with Apo Intampil and then you end with, Kudula's father, for example. But in between those extremes, there's many directions you can go. And each ancestor, well, not all of them, but a lot of them have a lot of sub-stories and stories where they interact with each other. So, it's not the story of one clan or one kin group. In fact, for Baligihan, there's like 4 or 5 different kin groups, and they're all part of this panod. And then the panod also touches on the kin groups of other communities as well. So it's like you could it's like trying to, maybe the best way to explain it is if the oral tradition is like a weaving, like an ikat of some sort, right? And when you have it written down, it's like you're trying to describe each thread, in order, but the real tradition is actually the completed, woven product. But in the written part, you're describing each single thread in isolation. And so it's kind of a struggle. There'll always be more threads.
Follow up that. Just mention, it ends with the father that's a good lure. Will it continue with him? Like, will there be a panod about it?
Yeah. In fact, the living panod is which actually it doesn't end with his father. There's some new kasama ako sa panod. So because when I entered their lives almost 30 years ago, or 13, matanda na. Yeah, I mean, when they recite certain parts, nandun na ako sa story. And then other people also, like the mayor of Baguio, mentioned in one part of it in Venice. So it's always brought into the present, and it's a living thing. So after Dato Butua, more will be added. Yeah, and in fact, Dato Butua keeps adding more stuff, as we go. So, but we just kind of tried to focus on what he felt was really, really important. That he was worried about what would be lost, including stories of people who were alive in our lifetime, but and the many adventures that they had, like really significant ancestors. They become Apo once they're gone. So, yeah.
I think we can go to a question from Zoom, actually, 2 kind of connected questions. Good afternoon, truly a fan of your work. I'd just like to ask if there's any fear in watering down the panod during the process of the project. Someone also added a question, how do you kind of grapple with that? How do you communicate in written form things that are implicitly quite oral? How do you put that in?
Well, that's the struggle now, and this was, they were worried that, what can be conveyed in written form is very limited. So we tried to supplement it by, having video recording of the story, and we're actually that's being edited, so I can't really show it to you. It's not unprocessed video like the one I showed you. It's actually deliberately recorded in order to be used as part of this IT education thing, so the kids can actually see it being recited, and maybe also the pronunciation of certain archaic words. And in fact, it's a glossary in this book. Anyway, what we're gonna say? Oh yeah. So it was definitely the acknowledgement that it would be watered down, and that's the sort of the nature of the problem, right? The translation, you lose things in translation, not just when you're translating. It's basically if you're translating it into another, not just another medium, but a completely different reality, a completely different understanding of the past, a very limited one. Yeah. So, but the choice was either we do it and deal with the limitations, or we risk losing everything when Budloa is gone.
I find the use of video really interesting. I know you only mentioned it as something you guys added on.
In the beginning, it was for fun, yeah.
But do you think that could be a legitimate way to, I guess, capture all oral tradition, kind of giving up this performance, adapting to video?
Yeah, well, that's definitely, I think, one of the key mediums that we could use, and that's why we did it that way. But at the same time, you know, in terms of Higa land, the need for electricity and you know, certain technology in order to have the video as the primary form, there's limits to that. And then also with video, you lose a lot of stuff. For us, the simplest approach was to write it down because it's easier to replicate. It's easier to kind of deal with than video, which you have retrieval problems in some cases. So it is then thought of as a supplement to rather than the primary form. And part of it also is that I'm quite limited in terms of my technical knowledge. So like I said, we were like very low tech about the whole thing, and low budget and low back most of the time. Yeah. And so yeah, but the video was in part, I really wanted to preserve how Dato Budloa's not just performance, but really embodiment of the Panood was so, I thought it was glorious. He's really delightful to watch, and I regret bringing a segment of it. But when if you ever meet Dr. Budloa in person, so if anybody goes to the view tech with Dr. Romil, I can't remember who was the one who told me about. Oh yeah, if you ever go, Dr. Budloa will probably be there at some point because he lives in the neighborhood. You know, he's a very kind of humble, unassuming guy, and kind of tends to kind of make himself really small around people. He's not a very physically imposing type of person, and you would not guess that he was a cultural authority the way he carries himself. Only in certain moments, but when he starts to recite the Panood, his whole demeanor changes. He's on, and he almost turns into a different person, and his face lights up, his voice modulates, it changes, and he's just very dramatic. The way he vocalizes things in different voices of people, and then, you know, you really get even if you don't understand the language, you get a really strong sense of the drama, you know, the excitement, the energy that when reciting this thing is something that is definitely lost when you have the written form. Yeah, and so it's such a gift to watch him perform this thing. And so we'd like to be able to have him do a whole performance in one go instead of different segments that we have done so far. And at some point we're hoping to do that. Hopefully. Yeah. So video definitely should be a part of it. But mainly because it's Budloa. I mean, I've seen other people do recitations of some of the oral traditions, and it's okay. I mean, it's still good, but it's different. Like it's like he becomes the character.
Thank you, Professor Oona, for such a wonderful, inspiring presentation. I'm interested in the young Higaonon generations. I'm wondering how maybe the millennials and the Gen Z are responding to this project.
Well, one thing I can definitely say is that when we started this 10 years ago, or over 10 years ago now, when we first did the first sort of attempt at writing things down, first I was trying to write things down, record things, and then I would try to write them down. But my Higaonon is quite limited, so it became a kind of a comedy, but it would read what I wrote down, and it was phonetically what was being said on the tape, but I divided the words wrong. And so they were like, no, it changes the meaning, and you're rolling on the floor laughing. So that's when we had, okay, the team will do it instead of me. And so that's what we were going through. But within the first week, we assembled maybe 15 pages of something. And I kind of preliminarily printed it out. And we kind of circulated it. And we did it, we tried to make it look like a little booklet. And the people who were the most interested in it were the teenagers. and they were reading it to the really young kids. And they were so excited about it. They were trading, they were going to each other's houses, reading it out and dramatizing. And that's when we knew we really have to do this. It was just sort of, we were trying it out, you know? And it was like, what's the word? It's like captured their imagination, and they demanded more. That we need more of this, we need more of this, we don't have this stuff. So part of that is they need stuff in Higaonon, in their own language. But then two, also these stories that they know that they exist, but they haven't been exposed to much, in part because they're already evangelical Christian community and was not encouraged by the missionaries, you know, to write those things down because they have to have a new Christian tradition. But at the same time, also, you know, doctors and all these other people have so much other stuff to do. They're farming, they're dealing with the government and all of this stuff, that there's not much time left in today's day-to-day life to just sort of sit around and tell these stories. And so that's the kids, teenagers. So I figured the small kids would find it exciting, but the teenagers, the ones in high school, were the ones who were really excited about it and demanding that we you know, finish it. So that's sort of part of what drove us to really kind of put our backs into it. And then there's been great interest from the IT Ed people who are also Higaonon for them to be able to use this in you know, as instructional material. And then there was another sort of debate about that, about whether we were going to hand things over to DepEd and have DepEd claim authority over it. So we decided to just keep it our own independent project with Lua as the author, and that we would donate copies rather than handing it over to DepEd for DepEd to print as a textbook. Yeah, so that was something that the community, not just the team, but the community itself said, no, this is ours, this is not the government. So yeah, so there's a lot of, I can't even remember what the question was, but I answered it.
Hello, hi. Thank you for the presentation. So it was very clear how the community takes ownership of it, control, access, and possession, these basic things in terms of indigenous culture. I just wanted to ask you something on a personal level, because I think this is something that, especially early career researchers like us, we deal with problems of translation. Like you pointed out, there's an incommensurability between written and oral forms. There is also an incommensurability between two languages, because they're two different epistemological languages. So in your book, and I assume that because it's also going to be distributed to a wider audience, including the academic audience, perhaps. No? Oh, okay.
In a different form.
Oh, in a different form. My question is something about how do you intend to go about these two different languages? And for us, especially, for example, myself, in Kankanaay, my Kankanaay, like your Higaonon, is Baroque. But to understand the Kankanaay, it goes from English to Filipino and then to Kankanaay. And I fear that in writing down, in trying to translate for others to understand what I heard, I fear that these layers of translation, there are a lot of things that we do. So if you could give us perhaps tips or on how to go about these translational challenges.
Yeah, tips. I don't know if I can give you tips, but I can tell you what's going on with it. One thing that I really pushed for, and very proud of pushing it, was we was going to make this entirely in Higaonon. Not one bit of Cebuano, Bisaya, or core English was going to be in it. They were saying, no, let's make the acknowledgement in Bisaya. Let's, at least put it. No. I said, no, this is the Higaonon book. For Higaonon, by Higaonon, it's going to be in Higaonon. I was like, that was where I asserted my privilege there. I was like, no, this is what we're going to do. And that was probably the only thing that I really insisted on. And I think in the end, they agreed with me that it was the right decision. And I'm very happy about that. But the fact is that language, Higaonon as a primary language is sort of going away, and fewer and fewer Higaonon children are being raised in Higaonon only environments. There's some places like Paligian where it's still basically 99.9% of the language that small children are exposed to is the first 5 years, all Higaonon only. That's because everybody there speaks Higaonon, including the public school teacher and the missionaries who are there, who are not there regularly anymore. But in other communities, there's a lot more Visaya, and in fact, especially children who go through the school system, who finish elementary school, then go into high school, they're exposed to a lot of Sinisaya and then also English and Tagalog in the schools, and then popular media, the internet, and then everything social media. And so there's all these other things that sort of dilute their Higaonon level, the level of what's supposed to be their primary language. So that was a problem that we had to deal with in terms of the book. Because if we made a book that nobody could read, then what was the point? So then Jerry Obilno came up with the idea of putting a glossary in, because he said, yeah, some of the books I have, in college, we have glossary, we do that. So put different, with each chapter, there's new words. And that was the one thing that we asked the other communities when we were doing cross-check, was to say, if there are words that you think we should explain, encircle them, tell us, and we will add it to the glossary. So looking forward to see what we come up with. We even established like an email address, a phone number for people to text stuff to, to report these things to us. And so, so that's the, dealing with the language issue. And so the plan now is, this is all Higaonon, and people will just have to make do with it how they can. Jerry is going to translate it into Cebuano Visayan, and because he said that more people can read it, because there's also a lot of Higaonon who grow up on the coast who don't speak Higaonon at all or don't know it, not just the deep language, but maybe hardly any of the language. At worst, I know more Higaonon than deep, which is not good. And then also so that other people can read it also, who are not Higaonon, although I emphasize to them that that should not be our priority. And so once Jerry translates it to Cebuano Visayan, the next step then, or maybe concurrently, is I'll do like an English translation and have an annotated version that then will be sort of the academic. So that'll be my work, but we're going to do it either concurrently, or I think I have to write my book about traditional authority first, because for my job, because otherwise, so they keep paying me. And then so maybe the annotated version in English, with side-by-side translation will be a work for me for later. So that's the sort of the different stages that we're at least agreed on in principle. And we want to do this while Ludoy is still alive, because if there's a question in interpretation, he's the one we need to talk to. It would be Dr. Yukmo, but Dr. Yukmo died. And frankly, we don't really trust anybody else to give us a real kind of story in terms of interpretation. So that's the language thing. So I can't really give you tips because we're still trying to figure it out ourselves.
I just wanted to ask, and most of them were males?
Yeah.
Are there any female foreigners?
There are, just not in that community. It's Nagkataon, that's the community that I'm most familiar with, and there's already a trust established. And so, and we really have had to draw on that sort of the depth of that relationship to keep this thing going. I'm making it sound a lot simpler than it was. There are a lot of struggles that we had, including with the community at large, who at one point felt that Dr. Budua and Jerry were getting they were getting too what do you call this? Getting too the expression in English is too big for your britches, but I don't know how to translate that. Yeah. Na parang they're getting too, sikat, yeah, and that they needed to be put in their place. And so there was actually like a debate that happened, like we had like a verbal fight in a tribal council meeting. That was very interesting. Yeah, so there were like moments like that we had to really struggle with when it came to getting to the point where we're at now. Sorry, what was your question again? You had a question. Oh yeah, okay. Sorry. The thing was we kept soliciting the involvement of women in the community but most of them would defer to their husbands. So the women whose husbands were on the, and except Jerry's not married, and yeah, he's not going to be marrying a woman. And so, but there are some people who are biased, who we deliberately said, look, you read it, please, And so hopefully a couple of them did respond, who are also part of the community. So the one thing in terms of gender in Panood was that the Baligyan Panood includes quite a few women in the list of ancestors who are included in the Panood. And this is significant. And so one thing I wanted to point out, which I think I mentioned in previous discussions here at UC Baguio, was that the Panood is their story as a people, the becoming and remaining people, and of course about their ancestors. But the people who are included as ancestors, remembered as ancestors in the Panood, are not the people who stuck to tradition. So this is, I want to kind of go back to this when I mentioned tradition versus innovation, is because their idea of tradition, the idea that that's encapsulated in the Panood and captured by customary law, all has to do with people who changed things. These are the ancestors who changed things and made innovation and made the Higaonon who they are today, slowly over generations. Some of them are women, and that's why they're remembered. They're not remembered just because they were the wife of somebody. They were the wife of somebody, they're always the wife of somebody, unfortunately. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, but they're always the wife of someone, but they did something. Either they were instrumental in their husband's success, or they really brought true innovation. And as we had discussions about why there were not an equal number of women and men covered as ancestors in Panood, Budlua started to think things over, and he made a conscious decision 10 years ago that moving forward, he was going to consciously include women and girls in the Panood. So in the sort of latter part, in the new road of the Panood, in that section, he makes an effort, I think more than other Panood, to include women in the story. Because, and this is the part where the rhetoric that they pick up from NGOs about, participatory governance and gender equality actually has had an impact on them. And in this particular community, they're, I would say, maybe more conservative than other Higaonon communities, which have a lot more women leaders who are at the forefront. In this one, the men are definitely the leader. There are women who are part of it, but they're basically the siblings or the wives of the Satus. So it's a more conservative community than others that I've encountered, more conservative than Tatrico or Kalipay. But yeah, so Tata Budlua basically has made a conscious decision, and we're going to include more women, especially because Budlua has daughters. And he was saying, he started thinking that way as part of this whole, we're raising questions about how come there's only, for every 10 male ancestors, there's like 2 women who are mentioned in the country. So yeah.
There are quite a few big questions on the kind of practical aspects of the research, but I just wanted to sneak in a quick question someone had about how you learned the language and if you actively learned it or were the challenge.
I've been trying to learn the language through immersion, and then also had some sort of help with Binukid dictionaries, it's a related language. Binukid is so much easier to learn than Higaonon. Binukid has a lot of time, but grammatically it's not that distant from Bisaya. So it's not that hard to pick up. It's just a matter of vocabulary and sort of understanding that just because words sound the same, they don't mean the same thing. We had a question earlier in the day, we were talking with grad students that I've had to do most of my research using Tagalog Visayan. Okay, and I gradually learned, well, actually not that gradually, it's very easy to pick up enough Higaonon that I can understand when they talk, even if I have to answer them in Tagalog Visayan. There's benefits and disadvantages to that, which we can talk about. But the fact is that this is the honest truth. I tried really hard. I went in there many times saying, okay, don't speak to me in Bisaya. It's going to be Higaon only. They lost their patience with me. They said, we're not going to sit around and watch you struggle with language when we can communicate perfectly in Bisaya. And they basically just first made fun of me because I was saying things wrong and making the wrong word choices, and my accent was funny, and I was hesitating so much, so self-conscious. And then after a while, they were like, even this is not amusing enough. We got stuff to do. We don't know, don't waste our time, basically, was their answer. Like, we can talk in Bisaya, why do you want to make it different? And so that's just what happened. But I picked up enough, and it's become kind of a cool thing, because if we go to a new community, like if I'm with Jerry or Butua or somebody else, they know I can understand it, but the new people don't. And so they talk about me, and they just kind of look at me and go. And then eventually they say, she can understand everything. And I'll be like, yeah. So it's become a kind of like something that we have fun with. Yeah. But speaking it sort of conversationally, sometimes I can do it, sometimes, a lot of times I can't. I can read it though. So I've been able to help edit the Panood, which I was very pleased with. I didn't think that my level was that good, but I was actually able to spot typos that they missed. So yeah, so it's a process, and it's taking forever.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think what I appreciated most would be the reflexivity. I don't even know if you are aware of that, but when you were discussing your project, the reflexivity that you had while conducting the project, and the reflexivity on the part of the people who participated in the project. So how could that be innate, or how could that be inherent, for instance, for researchers doing ethnohistory?
We're doing ethnographic research. I think that, well, at least in my training in the States, that's sort of deeply embedded in it already. We were encouraged in grad school to be, and even in undergrad, to be very reflective about it. And a lot of work by American anthropologists, maybe too reflective, but also British anthropologists. There's a lot of stuff where people have their ethnography, their monograph, and then they'll usually, in the past at least, would release a separate book of their field experiences, like sort of like a more of a travelogue, a more personal thing. And some of them are really rich. Some of them are the funniest things I've ever read. So there's a British anthropologist named Nigel Barley, who has some really, really funny sort of personal accounts of what they went through. But some of the other older anthropologists who I was influenced by, like David Maybury Lewis, who started the Cultural Survival Foundation, he had a separate book than his ethnography, which was about Shavanchi society in Brazil, or South America, maybe not Brazil, but one of those adjoining countries. And then he had a separate book, and I think it was called I can't remember the title of his personal account, but basically his adventure as a young anthropologist going into the field, but he brought his wife and their baby, and relating a lot of stuff that did not make it into the ethnography, into the book that's the academic book. All their personal experiences, struggles that they had. There's even one story where he related a terrible event where his wife ended up getting into a fist fight with a Shavanchi woman because the Shavanchi woman was abusing one of her kids, and David's wife Pia, who was Norwegian, I think, could not bear it. And she basically went in there and punched the woman out. And this is, in his personal account, that stuff doesn't make it into the ethnography. And that's really, you have to kind of really be honest with yourself about some of the things that you experience in the field. And so, part of the ethnographic methods that I was trained with was you keep a journal of what you're going through in the field. And I had a journal like that will never be seen by anyone, because there's a lot of very problematic emotions there about the people I was working with. And that's how, you kind of process what's going on with you. It's a very isolating experience, especially if you're there, early on in your field experience and are not really used to the community yet or not fully welcomed. You're not really part of the community yet. Yeah. So that's how you learn to process what's going on. I would go on my laptop every night and then just rant, and that's basically going to be burned to the ground. No one will ever see that. Yeah.
What may I just follow that up? Maybe because you're an anthropologist, but for non-anthropologists, one issue is usually making the researcher and subject divide, and usually objectification of the subject, so that that's usually, and in some cases, maybe the researcher doesn't even know that he or she has objectified the subject. So, maybe we will just have to be conscious about doing this.
For me, ethnographic research methods can be relevant to. You don't have to be an anthropologist to follow them. It's basically you don't even have to be working in a different culture to follow them. In fact, they're probably more useful even if you're working in your own culture. In fact, that to me is the hardest thing to do research in your own culture. It's easier to be objective and be empirical and see new things when you're dealing with a culture that's unfamiliar to you. I mean, there's problems. You can kind of exoticize and all of that and make assumptions. But if you're honest with yourself, you can work through that. But if you're working in your own community, with a culture that you're familiar with, it's hard to see things empirically. So I would say that the ethnographic research method is not just like how you do an interview, but part of that is also how you process. Part of that is also the reflexivity that's required. And all these little exercises, including writing the journal, is in part to help you achieve that, empiricism. So rather than objectivity, you're never really objective. If you understand your own positionality, then you realize you can never be objective. No one's ever truly objective. We all have our biases. What's that T-shirt that people are wearing? Something about theory is a bias, right? So, I mean, if you look at theory as how you see the world, you are your own walking theory, right? Your mind is your theory. How you see reality is your theory. And you have a bias no matter what. No matter what. You can't be devoid of bias. But you have to understand what your biases are. So your goal should be empiricism, meaning that you say things that can be verified by others. You have a basis for making certain claims. You understand and explain how you know what you know. You're conscious about your epistemology. So those are the things that you can strive for. And part of that is documenting. Take pictures, you have interviews, you have statistics, you count things. You interview several people about the same thing and look at where they coincide in terms of how they explain stuff. Those kinds of things. Take photos, take recordings. That's how you be more empirical. You support your place with data. So, yun lang.
Hi, Una. Thank you very much for that presentation. My question is actually related to reflexivity because the book is being printed or to be printed, right? And what struck me really is the participants' reflexivity in terms of being keenly aware that they are innovating, that they are not really trying to capture it, no matter how faithful they want to be in capturing the oral tradition. It's just impossible. So my question is there any part of the book where they explain this, or they actually say this in their own words of what they think of their legacy, what they think of what they're doing, and the product of such collaboration in their own words?
Jerry wrote a preface where he incorporated some of the Lloyd comments, where he sort of just touches the surface of it. But we really kind of went into it when, or Buzoa did and Jerry did, when we were presenting it to different communities, different Higaonan communities, and asking them to look it over for us to do cross check for us. So that's where it came out, not necessarily in the book, but there's a preface where it explains sort of what their purpose was, and that maybe it's not complete, it's not the whole thing, but this should be sort of, then he writing it again. He wrote something like this is something we're gonna that will hopefully keep growing. The work that they're gonna do is going. It's not a one and done sort of thing. It's going to work will continue. I mean, yeah. So this, yeah, not explaining it deeply like that, but they touched on it.
There's also a question here from one of our Zoom attendees. They write, you mentioned having the research validated by the community network since it is their problem. How exactly was this broached then, and what were the conversations like? It seems like a uniquely IP-focused research.
Well, that was the goal, to make it IP focused, because it's their project and it's their. So we're talking about the book project, the Padul project, not the traditional authority project, which I haven't really talked about, and that's sort of become less interesting to me, shall we say, even though I have a lot of data. But I already have the book title and everything, so I have to do it. Yeah. Yes, we wanted to make it IP focused, and in part, the other goal, the sort of more general goal, was to encourage the Onan to be their own ethnographers in the future. And so part of this effort, or if something stems from this originally, is we're talking about it, we just have to schedule it, that we will workshop with IP Ed people, or I will workshop with them. And we will talk about ethnographic methods and things like that, and work on co-authoring articles, academic articles, and establishing with them, these are college-educated teachers, certified teachers, who are extremely intelligent and innovative in terms of producing their own materials for IP education. Nobody told them how to do it, even though they did training here and there. It's all really new, actually, and they have their own ideas about doing these things, and they have been on their own recording elders talking about things, or recording stories and things like that. And so we're going to workshop that, and hopefully that's something that's going to be, become this whole new world where they are their own ethnographers and they get to be recognized academically as the experts on their own culture. Yeah, I'm not sure if this other part of the question.
Any other questions from the audience? We do have one more on Zoom. Actually, that's a few more.
Until we get kicked out of the room.
I wish to rewatch the video because I have poor internet connection as of this moment, but I was struck by what you said about oral tradition being not really concerned about what exactly happened. Can you please elaborate?
It's as far as what we understand, people study oral tradition, and a lot of them basing on the work on oral tradition or oral history by Jan van Stina, who sort of worked on Central Africa. And that to me is the sort of the Bible of oral tradition, and it really explains the fundamental differences. But we have our own, oh gosh, what's her name? Herminia Menez Coben, who's Filipina, but based in LA, already retired, and she's done a lot of stuff on oral tradition in the Philippines. And she explains the sort of the supplements to Van Stina stuff as far as my own knowledge. And explains how there's tropes, there's the equivalent of what we call memes, but more profound than that. Themes that appear in specific traditions that really communicate to the people whose tradition it is how they're supposed to process particular events that they relate about the past. So with Higaonon, a big trope in Higaonon oral tradition has to do with a passage or journey from one location to another. There's a lot of stuff like that in the oral tradition. And it's not just people resettling somewhere else. That in their own name, Hikaonon has to do with Gaon, has to do with going from, like, say, the coast onto dry land. I mean, sea onto dry land, or the lowlands, upland. It's about motion. It's never about sort of sitting still. So remember what I said about tradition versus innovation. So it goes deeper than that. It's about never sitting still. They're always in motion, sometimes literally. And so that's a constant theme. And sometimes the specifics of the story will change. Let's say in different places in Higaonon land, and also closely related, like Agusan and Manobo or other Manobo groups who are they're like cousins culturally. There's stuff about why people, explanations for why people moved from the coast into the interior. Okay, in their oral traditions, they were originally from the coast and they moved into the interior. And the story can be the plot device, I guess you could call it, could be that missionaries came and introduced a book, and people wanted to follow the old traditions, so they left. So sometimes there's been stories about the Spaniards arrived, and then so they wanted to avoid the Spaniards, so they left. The Americans arrived. One version I read, I think it's from Bukidnon. Wish I could remember who wrote it down. Where the Americans came and were forcing the little kids to go to school, and so they left. And then there's one where there were Chinese traders who were price gouging, so they left so that they didn't have to depend on stores for their food. Other times it's a disease outbreak, and then they left. So there's these things, but the important part of the story is not what the cause was. The important part of the story for the Higaonons in the oral tradition is that they left, that they moved. The motion is the important part, not the specifics of the cause. And this is something that they kind of, it's sort of like, to say the texture of their past, the texture of their pastness, their understanding of what happened before and where they came from. So that's the difference. Whereas in traditional Western historiography, you'll be like, well, okay, so let's say Americans forcing kids to go to public school. Okay, let's find documentation for that. Where were the schools? It becomes about those kind of details and not what the whole experience meant to the people who were subjected to it. So, they're asking different questions, and they asking different questions and they're answering different questions. And they're not necessarily in contradiction with each other, even though they cover completely different things. They might sound like completely different history.
There's also a question here about, there's a question from someone who would like to conduct research, specifically in Mindanao, about ecotourism and how it affects IT communities, but they feel like the FCIC is huge kind of deterrent for them. They're asking, are there any government agencies or private institutions that they can go to for help for funding?
No, I can't. I would encourage you to track down why you think Free Fire process is a deterrent. I mean, it's understandable that bureaucracy in the Philippines on any level is a problem. Okay, death by bureaucracy. We're all familiar with bureaucratic violence, and IPs especially so. They're subjected to it constantly. However, those of us who are in a position to pursue such research, especially if we come from the outside, we are incredibly privileged. And I think that it behooves us to try to follow the process, as much as we can, as closely as we can. I mean, of course, sometimes things are impossible. Okay, I'm not going to lie. There's going to be people in government who are going to make things impossible for you, depending on how who you approach or where you're working. But if you can, you should try to go through the process. If nothing else, then to serve as an example to other researchers from the outside. If you're constantly asking for exceptions to be the exception to the rule, that's the story of what's wrong with our whole country. Everyone wants to be the exception to the rule. No laws are followed. Okay, now this is just the FPIC process with NCIP. This is not like the law. It's not a constitution, right? But it's, I think, still important. But the other part of that with the FDIC is what it also communicates to the community that you want to work with. Okay? So the FDIC, as imperfect as it is, and just as deeper as imperfect, the FDIC, at least in principle, okay, communicates to the potential research subject that they're not just subjects, that they are human beings with rights, and they have the right to refuse to participate in your research, no matter how important you think it is. They can agree to, I mean, this is like basic ethics in anthropology, okay? And it's something that we go through in US universities with a process called the IRB, Institutional Review Board. It's basically FDIC, but through the university. And we're interrogated on, we have to show in our things we submit how we're going to protect their rights. And one of those rights is the right to refuse. Even if they agree, even the community agrees, and you paid the community money to, you know, grease the way so you can do research in their community, at any point they can say no. It's consent, informed consent, okay? And so, yeah, with everything that entails. They have a right to not tell you stuff. They have a right to not participate in your whatever research you're doing, no matter how important you think it is. You cannot pressure them into it. You can't force them into it. If they don't understand how their knowledge or how their interviews are going to be used, they have a right to say no. And not only that, it goes beyond that, because even if they agree, it's still your responsibility to protect them from stuff that they're not aware of. Because you're the one who knows everything. So that's for, at least for the, I don't know how much of FDIC in Philippines that is, but in the US, with the IRB process, even if the community or even an individual subject agrees to something, if you're aware that they don't fully understand what the consequences are of what they're agreeing to, it is your responsibility, not theirs. It is your responsibility to protect them and tell them, no, you know, you agreed to this, but you shouldn't do this because this is going to hurt you somehow. You know? So to me, that's sort of, those are the other aspects of the FDIC that we tend to forget, that it's about protecting the research subject. Now, I would agree that the government doesn't necessarily employ it that way, but that's how we should. Okay, that's how we should. We should own it and apply it in a way that benefits the people that we are studying. You know, for me, I see myself as working not just with them, but for them. And everything in my career, I owe to them. Okay, so I have that responsibility, sense of responsibility towards them. So that to me is what FDIC means, not just what the Philippine government says you're required to do. So I, from a position of privilege, do not complain about it.
Hello. I just want to ask, did the team ever come up with a discussion of literacy? Since, I'm not sure who, but I remember that you mentioned that one of the members of the team said, you said that, he was taught to study just so that he can continue, the tradition. So did the team ever come up with a discussion of literacy, especially that, it is a written work? And we all know that in IT community, education access is one of the issues. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, that was Dr. Budua, the lead, the project. Yeah, he's fairly literate. And he can write his name, he can recognize his name written, but like to fill out a form with, even with the stuff written down and he just copies it, he has a hard time with it. So yeah, with him, he was very explicit about, you know, this is what happened to me. I'm not going to let this happen to my kids. So he insisted all his children are college educated. Okay, one of his kids is a teacher now in the IB education system. I think all of them have regular jobs. You know, that was his goal and he accomplished it. But at the same time, he also valued heritage and tradition. And, you know, for him, being Higaonon is important. And he wanted also his children to be able to have that, and then their children as well. He's already grandparents. So for him, producing the book was sort of a way to balance that out. Because he was keenly aware that it's a choice that he had to make. That if he, stopped them from going to school, yes, they would be maybe be the bearers of the oral tradition now, but at what expense? It's the reality of the world that we have at hand that they all have to cope with. And he didn't want to have his children go through the hardships that he's going through. So, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah, but that was the discussion. That acknowledging that literacy is extremely important in this day and age, that it's extremely valuable, that all Higaonon should be literate, all Higaonon children should be literate, and all Higaonon children should be educated. And so making the book and going through this process was a way of contributing to that, because it's also contributing to literacy in the Higaonon language.
Towards the end of the lecture, you talked about how a lot of people on the project are almost complete culture bearers. Sometimes when they pass, it kind of passes with them. There's a question here about methods for passing it down instead of just focusing on preservation.
Yeah, I mean, there's many ways to pursue it. The traditional way, of course, is to, shadow an elder, to be mentored by an elder, and it's a lifelong learning process. That's the ideal, but nobody can really do that now, just because of the way the world is, especially when the younger people have to go to school and all of that, making money in a capitalist society is essential to be able to support yourself. So, that's definitely the traditional method. But doing it this way where there's a book, they can learn it, anybody can study it and be more attuned to it than another person who's just sort of reading it for fun. They can investigate further. And then so that's part of why the recording part is, going to be included. And we've also encouraging anyone who has questions to go to Dr. Gundula and kind of ask about them. And actually what we found is that just the process of trying to put this book together, writing things down and putting the book together, already has elicited a lot of interest from people, in part because, and this is really sad, but this is just the truth, how things work, in terms of like, how do you make traditional culture, cultural traditions relevant in this day and age? They got interested in it because I was interested in it. Look, a foreigner, outsider, it must be cool and interesting. They're interested in it. There's grant money. Look, they're getting, they're getting paid. They didn't really get paid. They got provided snacks. We did. And then because there's interest from the outside, then their interest perks up, like, oh. So for a lot of people, that's what happened. And it just reminds me of what happened when I went to graduate school with, her name is Trisha Allen. She studied traditional tattooing in Polynesia, which was disappearing at the time. And so part of her field work was, she went to different parts of Polynesia, all the way to Eastern Islands. We're based in Hawaii. Did my undergrad in University of Hawaii, and she went through New Zealand, basically all over Polynesia and Micronesia as well. And she asked people about tattooing, all the elders who, what their tattooing tradition was, how they did it, what the designs were. She's documenting all of this, talking to the old people. And what she found was, in the course of doing that and going to these different islands, because she's this foreigner who was asking about the old stuff, then the young people started getting interested. Saying, oh, what is he talking to these old people about? Oh, tattooing? Oh, you think that's cool? Oh, yeah, it's cool. And so what she started doing was she brought her tattooing kit with her, like, sort of more, modern tattooing. And because she thought, what if, we can see, what if we just tattoo people? And so the young people were asking her to tattoo them the traditional design that she had been documenting. And it created a sort of revival in these different places in the traditional tattooing. And then after a while, the younger people, this was like 25 years ago, 30 years ago, Younger people, the younger generation then started actively tattooing because he was inquiring about it. And so sometimes that's all you need in a community to trigger that kind of interest in the youth, because then they realize that it's cool and interesting, and that's what makes it relevant.
We want to thank Professor Oona so much for answering all our questions today. Very appreciate coming through. She's been kind enough to share her email, so if there's anything we weren't able to cover today, I guess.
Yeah. And if you can put on the subject line, UPB, so I know it's maybe Baguio or related or something. And of course, remind me who you are, because I'm not going to remember people's names. But yeah, I mean, you should just email me. It might take me a long time to write back, especially if I'm traveling. But I will eventually write back.
All right, thank you so much for coming to our CSS Indigenous Studies lecture series. Thank you so much. And there is some cost outside, I believe. Otherwise, yeah, I think we're done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks to you on the Zoom.
For those who are interested.
If you guys would like to stay for the photo, we'll be taking that in a little bit.
Do you know what these this is mama, diba? What are the other ingredients? Muyo is the nut, diba?
Hi, thank you a lot for coming to this event. If you haven't already, please fill up the evaluation form so you can receive your certificate of attendance. Thank you. And for those who are looking for a copy of the live stream, please check out the YouTube channel of the College of Social Sciences. The live stream will be available for replay right there, but you might have to wait for a few hours for it to be available. Thank you very much.